Hello and welcome to Byju's IAS. Let's take up the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper by looking at a column from page number 6 of the Delhi edition. In this article, the writer evaluates the way forward for the India China relationship after a year of heightened tensions at the border. The writer argues that the India China relationship has always been a victim of unrealistic expectations that have been set on both the sides, and hence the best way forward for them to normalize their relationship would be to lower their expectations of each other and to set realistic goals and ambitions. See, this conclusion was arrived at a recent track 2 dialogue that was held between leading strategic thinkers of both the sides. A track to diplomatic dialogue is essentially an informal diplomatic dialogue that involves former diplomats, former military officials, and even strategic experts. And such track two dialogues are held between think tanks of the two countries with the support of the respective governments. At one such track two dialogue that was recently held, experts from both the sides have agreed that the India China relationship has been affected by unrealistic expectations, and the best way forward would be to lower the expectations and to set realistic goals. See, if you go back to the beginning of diplomatic relations between India and the People's Republic of China, from the very beginning itself, there were several ambitious goals that were laid out. Both the countries went on to sign the Panchsheel Agreement, or the five principles of peaceful coexistence, and they laid out idealistic goals of restoring some pan Asian civilizational partnership, and they even popularized the slogan Hindi Chini Bye Bye. But a few years later, eventually what we got was the 1962 war that led to the complete breakdown of relations between India and China. If you look at the late 1940s and early 1950s, yes, India and China were two large Asian countries with a rich civilization, and both had witnessed a dramatic political transformation, leading to hopes that the newly born independent nation of India and the newly established PRC, or the People's Republic of China, could go on to champion some sort of pan Asian civilizational partnership. While these ambitions were driven by hope, they were too idealistic at the same time because the existing differences in their thinking was not taken into account. And both the sides not only failed to understand each other's perception of the border, but they also went on to commit a series of mistakes which eventually culminated in the 1962 conflict. With this war, the unrealistic ambitions under the Hindi Chini Bye Bye slogan was broken, thus leading to decades of hostility between the two nations. Now, something similar can be said about the current state of relations as well. Over the last 15 years, a lot has been said that India and China are going to lead the Asian century in global geopolitics. And it has been hoped on several occasions that the India China relationship shall be the defining relationship of this Asian century. Accordingly, former Prime Minister Manmohan Singh believed that there is enough space in the world for both India and China to rise together peacefully and not only flourish together but also to cooperate with each other towards resolving the pressing challenges that are facing the world. Then, after the Modi government came to power in 2014, Prime Minister Modi went ahead to invest heavily in a friendly and cordial diplomatic relationship with China. But eventually, the Doklam dispute of 2017 and the latest clashes in Ladakh last year have shattered this dream. Following the Doklam crisis, Prime Minister Modi again reached out to China with high expectations, and subsequently, a lot of progress was achieved in the India China relationship as a result of the Wuhan Informal Summit, which was followed up with the Mamlapuram Informal Summit. While these informal summits held between 2017 and 19 did raise expectations and hopes, it eventually couldn't prevent the breakout of last year's border clashes in the Ladakh sector. The latest border tensions between the two sides has been the highest escalation that we have witnessed since the 1960s, and this clearly illustrates a pattern in the India-China relationship. Every time when there is normalcy in the relationship, both the sides they set out an idealistic agenda with unrealistic expectations and goals, and eventually the failure to achieve any tangible progress and the failure to acknowledge each other's differing perceptions results in conflicts. And hence, the writer argues, in line with the conclusions of this Track 2 dialogue, that India and China need to be more realistic in their relationship and they need to lower their expectations and they should engage in hard talk with each other to find their shared interests and mutual concerns. And such a realistic assessment may be more rewarding than an ambitious and outright unrealistic expectation, despite some of their irreconcilable differences. Based on this conclusion, the experts who participated in the Track 2 dialogue have identified three priority issues that can provide for a more realistic approach in the India China relationship. This includes questions over their boundary dispute, concerns with regard to their bilateral trade, and as well as each other's hesitance with regard to any third party involvement or external engagement on any subject of their mutual concern. Next, in a related article on page number 8, the Chief of the Indian Navy has flagged the growing Chinese naval presence in the Indian Ocean region while virtually addressing the Raisina Dialogue. See, the Raisina Dialogue is India's premier diplomatic conclave organized by ORF or Observer Research Foundation, which is India's leading think tank in association with the Ministry of External Affairs. During this ongoing conclave, the Chief of the Indian Navy has flagged the concerns posed by China in the Indian Ocean region, and he has stated that India understands why Chinese presence has been growing in the Indian Ocean. The growing naval and diplomatic presence of China in the Indian Ocean can be explained by the fact that Chinese economy is looking west, and in order to access sources of energy, markets, and key resources, China has become dependent on regions to the west of it, including Southeast Asia, South Asia, West Asia, and of course Africa. In the countries belonging to these regions, China has made heavy investments in order to tap sources of energy, new markets, and as well as to gain access to key resources. So, as the popular saying goes, the flag follows the trade. That is, wherever the trade of the country goes, the flag of the country follows, meaning the diplomatic and military priorities of any country is based on its trade priorities. So, this growing economic interest of China in the Indian Ocean has directly translated into its increased naval capabilities, which is marked by its increasing deployment over the last 15 years, along with the addition of frontline warships, including the commissioning of two aircraft carriers. The Chinese Navy is well on its way to become a true blue water navy that could even challenge the naval dominance of the United States. The Chief of the Indian Navy has acknowledged that China is in the process of building one more advanced aircraft carrier, which would be in line with its growing naval ambitions. Just a few years ago, in 2017, China even opened its first overseas naval base at Djibouti, which is a key African country located near the Horn of Africa. This naval facility of China has increased the operational reach of the Chinese Navy, and the PLA Navy has not only stepped up its anti-piracy deployment near the Horn of Africa and the Gulf of Aden, but it has also raised its military and diplomatic profile across all the key regions that are a part of the Indian Ocean, in line with its trade and economic priorities. While this focus of China on the Indian Ocean region is understandable, what causes concern for India is its rising aggressiveness and its repeated willingness to violate the rules based world order. So, this rising presence of China in the Indian Ocean has led the Indian Navy as well to expand its capabilities and reach by stepping up naval relations with like minded countries across the Indian Ocean. Through frequent military exercises and through enhanced defense relations with countries of the Indian Ocean, and as well as through regional forums such as the IORA or the Indian Ocean Rim Association and the Indian Ocean Naval Symposium, the Indian Navy has stepped up its presence and further expanded its reach and strengthened its naval capabilities in order to effectively counter the growing presence of China in the IOR. In this context, the Navy chief has highlighted the high degree of interoperability that the Indian Navy has achieved, particularly with the Quad nations. With US, Japan, and Australia, the Indian Navy has achieved a very high degree of interoperability through the signing of naval agreements, through the conduct of joint military exercises, and as well as through the sharing of information and acquisition of weapons. And these four members of the Quad, that are often referred to as the Diamond of Democracies or the Asian Security Diamond, have taken collective steps to enforce a rules based order in the Indo Pacific by keeping a close eye on rising Chinese naval activities in the Indian Ocean. Now let's take up a column from page number 6 in which the writers evaluate the trust of the citizens from a caste perspective in our public institutions. This analysis is based on the data that has been brought out by the India Human Development Survey 2015 report. See, IHDS is a periodic human development survey that is carried out by the leading academic institutions of India and the United States. In the 2015 report, researchers were looking to identify the extent of trust and faith that different caste groups place on public institutions. Because, see, the caste hierarchy in the society represents the socio-economic status of different groups and communities, which is arranged or organized as per the caste hierarchy. At the top of the social ladder, we have the upper caste and the higher caste, followed by OBCs, and at the bottom rung, you find the most deprived classes, that is, the scheduled castes and the scheduled tribes. So, the writers are trying to estimate the extent of trust that the different castes and communities of India have in our state governments, judiciary, and the police based on the findings of the IHDS report. As per these findings, in general, a majority of the citizens have very low trust on their state governments, whereas a majority of the population has a very high degree of trust in the judiciary. And again, in contrast, majority of the citizens have very low trust on the police. So, in general, if you rank the extent of public trust in our public institutions, the judiciary enjoys the maximum trust, followed by state governments, and with the police being ranked at the bottom of the list. See, it's very important to understand the extent of trust that the people are placing in their public institutions, because trust impacts outcomes. This logic applies for any sector. You look at financial sector, for example. Trust impacts growth and income. Similarly, in the labor markets, higher trust manifests into higher levels of cooperative management and cooperative relations between the labor class and the capitalist class, thus resulting in higher levels of productivity. In the legal system as well, there is a strong positive correlation between trust and the quality of the legal system. Similarly, there exists a correlation between the extent of trust the people have in their public institutions and the quality of governance that is being delivered by the public institutions. When the writers look specifically at the trust enjoyed by state governments, they find that the lower castes, that is OBCs, followed by SCs and STs, display the highest extent of trust on the state governments, whereas the upper castes have very low trust on the state governments, and according to the writers, this anomaly could be largely a result of the quota system, that is, the policy of affirmative action, which provides for reservation in education and jobs. Since the SCs, STs, and the OBCs are the beneficiaries of the quota system, they possibly display a higher degree of trust in the state governments as they anticipate themselves to be the beneficiaries of this quota system. On the other hand, the upper castes are at the receiving end of the quota system, and this might be correlated to their lower trust on the state governments. The judiciary, on the other hand, enjoys widespread trust from different castes, and most communities in the country display a very high degree of trust in the judiciary. Now, this again is quite surprising, despite the huge backlog of cases in the Indian judiciary and the frequent failure of the Indian judiciary to deliver timely justice and quality justice. But this high extent of trust enjoyed by the judiciary could be explained by the general belief that the common people have in the judiciary about its independence and autonomy. The police, on the other hand, paint a very poor picture, and especially the lower communities, that is, SCs and STs, they display very low levels of trust on the police. This is seen as a reflection of the endemic corruption in the policing system and the endless cases of brutality and discrimination that the police reportedly display against the lower castes and communities. The inherent biases and prejudices of a caste based society and the excessive politicization of our police is directly correlated to repeated incidents of brutality and discrimination being faced by the lower castes at the hands of the police. So, in conclusion, we need to understand that trust is something that is shaped by belief, which we inherit from earlier generations, and it is also shaped by the current environmental conditions that are prevailing around us. So, by and large, the judiciary enjoys a higher degree of trust, and across the socio-economic spectrum, most castes and communities display a higher degree of trust in the judiciary. But the same cannot be said about the state governments, because only a select few communities display higher trust in the state governments, whereas the lowest amount of trust enjoyed by the police is a clear reflection of the caste based inequalities in our society and as well as in our public institutions. The only way in which our public institutions enjoy a higher degree of trust, that to broad based trust from all communities, is by focusing on inclusive, transparent, and equitable governance. Now let's take up a column from page number 7, which illustrates the horrors faced by the LGBTQ plus community in orthodox societies such as India. The writer refers to the tragic case of Professor Ramchandra Siras, who used to teach at the Aligarh Muslim University. A few years back, he was caught having consensual sex with another man, and as a result, he was treated as an outcast socially and professionally, and in the process was made to suffer severe mental trauma, eventually leading to his mysterious death in 2010. The sufferings of Professor Ramchandra Siras and the horrors encountered by him have been beautifully depicted in the much acclaimed movie Aligarh, starring Manoj Bajpayee. The writer of this column states that the time has come to put an end to such sufferings and horrors that are faced day to day by the LGBTQ plus community in the country. Because in a modern civilized society, homosexuality needs to be accepted, and the criminalization of consensual homosexuality needs to stop. In this context, the writer refers to a popular essay known as Criminal Love, written by R. Raj Rao, in which he says that there are three essential agencies that are seen to be universal and essential for the existence of mankind. These three agencies include religion, law, and medicine. But when it comes to homosexuality, all the three essential agencies are completely against it. And if orthodox religion stigmatizes homosexuality, draconian laws and outdated medicine have failed to recognize that homosexuality is a part of normal human behavior as far as the LGBTQ plus community is concerned. The writer of this column goes on to equate Professor Ramchandra Siras of India with Alan Turing of the United Kingdom and draws parallels between their sufferings. Alan Turing was a very popular computer scientist and mathematician who played an instrumental role in cracking the encrypted coded messages of the Axis powers during the Second World War. Despite his immense contribution to the war efforts, he was convicted in 1952 of gross indecency for being gay. In the past, many countries, many societies have tormented and haunted LGBTQ plus community, but eventually several of these jurisdictions have progressed and they have come to repent their historical mistakes. In the United Kingdom, for example, the sufferings of Alan Turing was recognized, which eventually paved the way for a progressive law which has been named after Alan Turing himself. The Alan Turing Law of the United Kingdom provides for posthumous pardon and as well as an automatic formal pardon for living people as well. It essentially decriminalized homosexuality and provided for the acceptance of the LGBTQ plus community in the United Kingdom. In this context, if you look at homosexuality in India, India still has a long way to go to catch up with Western societies which have adopted much more progressive modern laws, and the failure of India on this front could be largely attributed to the orthodox nature of India's religious society. While there is some evidence available to indicate that homosexuality in the Indian civilization was celebrated during the ancient medieval times, the increasing orthodoxy of the Indian society, inspired by conservative views of religion, followed by colonial rule, led to the criminalization of homosexuality in 1862 with the inclusion of the notorious Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code. For several centuries, this provision of the IPC continued to torment members of the LGBTQ community until this provision was struck down as unconstitutional in a landmark historic ruling of the Supreme Court in 2018 in the Navtej Singh Johar case. Prior to this historic ruling of the Supreme Court in 2009, the Delhi High Court had provided for the decriminalization of homosexuality under Section 377 by arguing that it eroded the right to equality that is enshrined under Article 14. The Delhi High Court passed this landmark ruling in the Nas Foundation case, and it had held that Section 377 of IPC offends and erodes the fundamental right to equality enshrined under Article 14 because of its unreasonable classification and discriminatory targeting of homosexuals as a separate class. But this landmark and progressive ruling of the Delhi High Court was reversed by the Supreme Court, unfortunately, in 2013 in the Suresh Kumar Kaushal versus Nas Foundation case. Through this ruling, the Supreme Court had reinstated the criminalizing provisions of Section 377. But thankfully, in 2018, with the right intervention of the Supreme Court in the Navtej Singh Johar case, Section 377 was declared as unconstitutional, and ever since, homosexuality has been decriminalized. So, in this context, the writer argues that the time has come for India to enact its own version of the Alan Turing law by following the model of the United Kingdom, and it could aptly name this law as the Cyrus Act after Professor Ramchandra Cyrus. The writer says that following the decriminalization of homosexuality and following the striking down of Section 377 of IPC as unconstitutional, India should enact a Cyrus Act that will provide for posthumous pardon along with the automatic formal pardon for living people who otherwise were being treated as a criminal tribe for their sexual orientation. The writer says that such an act with such provisions would do justice to the LGBTQ community, even though this comes as a form of delayed justice. Now let's look at the mains practice questions. The first question: as India and China chart a course forward after last year's rupture in ties, they may find a conversation that is driven by hard talk and finding shared interests, even if modest ones, to be more rewarding than bearing misplaced expectations. Examine the statement. The second question: the findings of the IHDS survey report of 2015 on castes and their trust in state governments, judiciary, and the police are revealing. Elucidate. Kindly write an answer to these questions and post your answers in the comment section below. This concludes our discussion for today. Thanks for watching.